and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. 2020 will forever be known as the plague year, but largely due to the pandemic, it was also a year of increased hunger around the world. That's according to a multi-agency United Nations report released last month, which found that the number of undernourished people rose by 118 million worldwide, to a total of about 768 million, nearly 1/10 of the global population. Much of that increase was due to COVID-19, a crisis that continues to expose weaknesses in our food systems, the report warned. Today on Trendlines, we're devoting the episode to a discussion of why and how our food systems have become so vulnerable and what it will take to reverse the trend of increasing hunger. My guest is someone who spent her entire career studying these issues. Julie Howard is a senior advisor to the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she's also an independent consultant on international development issues with a focus on agriculture and youth development in sub-Saharan Africa. She previously worked at a number of government and non-governmental organizations, including a stint as the first chief scientist in the Bureau for Food Security at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Julie, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Even before the major spike in world hunger in 2020 that was documented in the UN's latest assessment, rates of food insecurity and undernourishment had actually been creeping up in the 2010s. What are some of the major long-term causes of this uptick?
Well, that's right. In 2014, what had been kind of a decades-long downward trend in the number of hungry people began to tick up again. Some 768 million people faced hunger in 2020, which is an increase of about 118 million from 2019. So over the last 10 years, the frequency and intensity of conflict, climate variability and extremes, and economic downturns have increased significantly. And these are undermining food security and nutrition around the world. And last year, of course, these factors were all exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and they continue to be roiled by the pandemic. So when we think about these long-term drivers, conflict, climate variability, economic downturns, each of them is unique, and they're all external to food systems, but they interact to create multiple and compounding impacts at many different points within food systems. So the majority of undernourished people live in countries that are affected by several of these drivers. So for example, the UN estimates that about 60% of the undernourished live in countries that are affected by conflict, but this is often linked to climate and economic factors. And the influence of these factors is made more difficult by high levels of income inequality.
Now, it's not just hunger and undernourishment that are increasing. We're also seeing a rise in adult obesity in every region of the world. That seems a little counterintuitive at first, so how do we reconcile those two trends?
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive. The facts are 1 in every 9 people in the world today is hungry, and 1 in every 3 is overweight or obese. Underweight tends to be the persistent issue for the poorest countries, while overweight and obesity predominantly occur in wealthier countries. But it's more complicated than that because income inequality within countries and differences across regions and in rural and urban areas mean that more and more countries are experiencing what we call the double burden of malnutrition, where there's undernutrition in some segments of the population, but that coexists with overweight, obesity, and other diet-related non-communicable diseases, such as an increasing rate of diabetes and heart disease. So it really comes down to this. Poor diets are negatively affecting human health at both ends of the spectrum. A bit more on obesity. Obesity globally, food consumption has been increasing more rapidly than population growth in recent decades. And this is in response to rising incomes, increasing agricultural production and trade, and changing food preferences. There's been expanding demand for animal source, processed, and ready-to-eat foods, but overconsumption of these foods and sugar-sweetened beverages runs counter to the emerging evidence on what constitutes a healthy diet. And in addition, Public policies around the world now for decades have largely focused on improving the productivity of major staple food and feed crops. So think rice, maize, wheat, and cassava as the foundation for national food security. But the evidence suggests that the goal of making staple foods relatively less expensive has inadvertently contributed to less diversity in agricultural systems and in food environments. So we're not able to provide anymore an adequate variety of affordable, safe, and nutrient-dense foods. So today, poor diets are the leading contributor to the global burden of disease, with negative health effects resulting from inadequate calories, hunger, overconsumption of calories, so overweight or obesity, and insufficient intake of micronutrients, which is hidden hunger. The relative costs of healthy, nutrition-rich foods like fruits, vegetables, and legumes are a factor. Estimated some 3 billion people in the world are too poor to afford even the cheapest nutritious diet.
Now, these issues are often discussed purely in their health impacts, their direct health impacts on people, but they actually have other implications as well. I mean, you mentioned diabetes, and that's a chronic condition that requires constant care, constant visits to healthcare facilities, and with a high number of people paying visits to health facilities, that poses a strain on healthcare systems, and we saw a little bit of how that played out during the pandemic.
Well, yes, exactly. I think that the fear, Elliot, is that the coming health crisis is going to be sort of the elephant that eats national budgets in the future, with more and more people needing care, needing medicines for these chronic conditions and able to get it.
The UN report that came out last month was pretty sober reading, and among the many depressing passages was the warning that the gender gap in food insecurity grew even larger in 2020. More women were food insecure than men already in 2019, but that difference was even wider at the end of the year. Can you talk about the gender dimensions of hunger, why women are often more likely to be at risk, and what the consequences of that gender gap are?
Yes, it is depressing. I agree with you. So women play critical roles in food systems. They're producers, they're laborers, they're processors, traders. Of course, they're also consumers. They do this important work, but they face a lot of constraints and limitations that are in turn shaped and reinforced by social and structural inequalities in food systems. So in the agriculture sector, for example, women often have unequal access and in some cases unequal rights to important resources like land and water, pasture, technologies like improved seeds and fertilizers, chemical inputs, technology information, and extension and advisory services. So their unequal access to these resources reduces their potential to be productive in agriculture. Now, because of social norms and this differing access to key resources, men and women have different capacities to mitigate risk and respond to shocks like COVID-19 and economic shocks. The types of capacities needed to strengthen resilience are built by developing and leveraging resources and networks to help reduce risk and facilitate faster recovery. But there's gender differentiated access to these resources. So women have fewer assets, they lack access to information services or credit, and this affects their capacity to deal with, recover from shock and stress events. So that's some of the explanation for this continuing widening of the gap between men and women. Women also have fewer adaptation options than men because norms often restrict their freedom of movement and access to transportation. They also have limited time due to major responsibilities for home and childcare. So something we often don't think about, we've seen in recent years the important role that digital technologies can play in providing access to context-specific climate information and agricultural recommendations. And digital financial services are increasingly widespread. So this is a very welcome development. But we sometimes overlook the fact that women and men often have very different access to digital devices and also very different information needs. But on the positive side, we're now understanding more about how to address some of these issues. So women's participation in collaborative farming schemes or group networks can help them get broader access to resources and expand their social networks. And this can help can strengthen their capacity to respond to shocks like COVID-19 and climate resilience. For example, work in Mali has shown that women's participation in community groups and their enhanced access to credit has led to their ability to adopt climate smart agricultural practices and technologies.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, the role of technology in addressing these issues? Because this is something we've actually covered in the past on previous episodes. We had Mary Ellen Iskandarian, the CEO of Women's World Banking, on to talk about financial technologies and their promise to empower women. I think it's a really important area, but also an area that has some degree of peril attached to the promise of it.
Access to finance, access to credit, is a problem I think that I've been reading and studying about, for the last 30 or 40 years. And I think we see digital finance opportunities. That's definitely seeing expansion of banking, right? So, and transfer of money and ability to save. You still, though, have the problem of there's not a lot of lending that's happening, through digital technologies yet, because you're still sort of lending tied to assets, right? So you need a land title, or need a building title, or need some sort of equipment to serve as surety. So, and that continues to be a problem, for women and for men, but especially for women. So I think you're seeing the rise again and reinforcement of some of the traditional community savings groups, and so women who are able to collect money and to lend to each other. And that's now beginning to play a role in expanding their access to technologies as well. So, but there's still, a lot of work to be done to expand financial access for women and for other groups and for youth, for that matter.
The UN report also touches on the difficulty of identifying entry points for interventions to address the sort of multiple drivers of food security that you spoke about earlier in our conversation, whether it's conflict or whether it's climate related. All of these things tend to interact with each other. And that makes it really hard to just know where to begin, where to start tackling the problem. But the report recommends taking a so-called food systems lens. What does that term mean in this context, food systems? And why is it so important when trying to get a handle on this problem?
Well, so food systems, by food systems, that encompasses the whole array of activities, of actors and organizations that are involved in producing, processing, transporting, and consuming food. And so the frameworks that we're using now to describe food systems are also explicitly recognizing the relationship of the food system to human health, as we've been discussing, but also to environmental sustainability and economic development. The frameworks then try to map the roles and interactions of key actors within this complex system. So within the agriculture part of that system, but also the relationships to health, environmental sustainability, and economic development. And so why is this important? Well, for the past 60 years, agriculture innovation has fed the world and served as an engine of inclusive economic growth. High-yielding staple crop varieties, fertilizers, new agronomic approaches are the foundations for U.S. production agriculture, and their spread has enabled really dramatic increases in agricultural productivity and the reduction of rural poverty around the world. But today, there are increasing doubts about whether this model, the productivity-centered, agriculture-focused model, is going to be adequate to nourish 10 billion people in the world by 2050 without destroying the planet. So 3 points here. So first, in the U.S. and globally, public policies focused on improving the productivity of major staple food and feed crops made the foods more abundant and less expensive. And so the research now suggests that this unintended impact, as I mentioned before, has been a less diverse food environment that's unable to provide an adequate variety of affordable, safe, and nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables, legumes, and for lower income groups, available, affordable dairy, meats, and seafoods. And poor diets, we said, are now a leading contributor to disease and early mortality. Second point, climate change is dramatically affecting agricultural systems around the world. So raising temperatures, reducing yields, shifting rainfall patterns, increasing drought frequency and flooding. So in some regions, climate changes are also exacerbating tensions that are then we're seeing fueling displacement and migration. And agriculture itself is a major factor in climate change, responsible for nearly a quarter of global annual greenhouse gas emissions. And third, agriculture's consumption of natural resources is also unsustainable. The inefficient application of inorganic fertilizers, a key factor in agricultural productivity gains, has led to runoff of excess nitrate and phosphate and increasing red tides and dead zones in rivers and oceans. Over half of the 120 billion tons of nitrogen fertilizers used for agriculture each year is thought to end up in waterways. So, expanding land use for agriculture, deteriorating soil quality, loss of biodiversity, and contamination of waterways and air are already pushing agriculture's consumption of natural resources past the limits of planetary sustainability. So, all of these factors suggest the need for a big conceptual shift away from the laser focus on agriculture, and especially production agriculture, to reshaping the global food system so that, yes, it becomes more productive, but it also becomes more resilient, more environmentally sustainable, and healthy.
In listening to your response just now, I was recalling our conversation that we had on the show last week with a guest, Deborah Kochever, who heads a project at Tufts University called Stop Spillover, which aims to prevent the spread of animal-borne illnesses, zoonotic viruses. She was talking about a concept called One Health, which is this idea that the health of animals, the health of the environment, the health of humans are all interrelated. What you're talking about sounds like something very similar, just applied to food, the idea that we can't disentangle any of these factors from our food systems.
Absolutely, yes. It's very. In fact, and One Health is a very important part of this concept. So, I mean, you could slot One Health for livestock and its relationship to human health is part of this whole reconceptualizing what it will take to transform our food systems.
And is one part of this essentially a shift away from sort of monocultural farming and toward more mixed use agricultural use of land?
Yes, I think so. In fact, it was interesting in listening to the pre-summit, the UN Food Systems Summit, which had its planning event late last month. There was a lot of talk about diversification of production systems and a big focus also on improving soil health. So diversifying not only crops, but also thinking about how to incorporate agroforestry, how to incorporate sort of more conservation-minded methods. So yeah, I do think there's still the need, of course, to improve productivity, of our major staple crops, but you've got at the same time, this compelling need to look at the health of our natural resources of water and soil, in combination with what will it take to reduce our call on natural resources. At the same time, sort of looking at what will it take to produce not just one or two or three main crops, but a whole constellation of commodities, of plant and animal commodities that will offer a menu that's healthier to consumers. So, and don't forget, it's not just the availability of those commodities at a better price, but it's also real need to change consumer behavior and consumer demand away from sort of heavily processed, high fat, sugary things to healthier foods, to legumes, to fruits and vegetables.
That's a really important point, because I know that we see, especially in a lot of lower to middle income countries, the trend that as people's income grow, they tend to crave more complex proteins and sugary foods, almost as sort of a reinforcement of their newfound status. And that tends to also reinforce this double burden that you talked about of obesity and malnutrition.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on, Elliot. It's interesting because I think years and years ago, there was this assumption among agricultural economists like me, that it was really it was really a task of increasing incomes. Yeah, if you could get incomes up, people would choose, the right kinds of food. And big shock to find that actually, their consumption of sugary sodas increases. If you do surveys and in the farthest reaches of rural anywhere, you can get these sugary sodas. You can also, get, the snack foods, the processed snack foods that are just not healthy, and that's absolutely what people will buy and eat. It's also, a time constraint. As women go into the workforce, they may no longer have the time and energy to spend 6-7 hours doing the traditionally cooked meal. So reaching for something fast, some cereals, etc. Is not necessarily the best choice for the family's health.
The pandemic has really highlighted the vulnerability of our food systems in a lot of different ways. And one thing that's gotten a lot of attention is food supply chains. In fact, one of the UN report's 6 recommended pathways for transforming food systems is intervening along food supply chains to lower the cost of nutritious foods. What does that mean in more concrete terms, though, and what might it look like?
Sure. Well, so one set of actions could be investments in research, in policies that stimulate the diversification of production in food and agriculture sectors towards nutritious food, including fruits and vegetables, legumes and seeds, as well as animal source foods and biofortified crops. So some examples. So biofortified varieties of different crops are increasingly available, like including vitamin A rich sweet potatoes, corn, iron biofortified beans. And in Rwanda, for example, beans are a major staple, but in iron biofortified beans have been rapidly adopted by farmers and consumers. Approaches to promote climate resilience and diversification can be combined. In Zimbabwe, there's a program that promotes conservation agriculture for increasing climate resilience and increasing ag productivity. It also helps farmers adopt biofortified varieties of different crops. Another example is the nutritional quality of food products and beverages can be improved by post-harvest fortification of staple foods. So you can think of iodized salts, or you can think of fortifying wheat or maize flours with iron and folic acid, like we have some of our breakfast cereals are fortified. So food manufacturers and retailers can also reformulate their products to eliminate industrial produced trans fatty acids and reduce levels of saturated fat, sugars, and salt. So another kind of innovation, I think, is marketing of fruits and vegetables. It's been difficult because those are so highly perishable. They spoil so rapidly. So some innovations are coming up in storage and in refrigeration that are making refrigeration accessible even in low and middle income countries. So there's one innovation called cold hubs in Nigeria, and cold hubs are modular solar-powered walk-in cold rooms that provide 24/7 off-grid storage and preservation for fresh fruits and vegetables. These cold rooms are installed in markets and farms within the reach of farmers and retailers, and they're capable of extending the shelf life of fruits and vegetables from 2 days to 21 days. It's incredible. But as we were talking about before, changing consumer behavior is really going to be key to improving the healthiness of diets. So in this regard, large-scale government purchases for institutional feeding programs, like for schools, the military, hospitals, these can do 2 things. They can provide a market, an important market for producers. It can also increase the exposure of key consumers to healthier menus. So national and local governments can also provide incentives for school gardens and for urban gardening projects to make fruits and vegetables a more regular part of the diet for children in urban residents.
You touched on climate resilience and the important role that plays in building resilient food systems. This is obviously a topic that we could do a whole other episode on, but maybe you could just briefly tell us about some other interventions, successful interventions that we're seeing in this specific regard, particularly in some of the countries that are especially vulnerable to climate change.
Yes, there is progress on this front. Let me talk about three examples. The first one is drought-tolerant maize. So, as we discussed, climate change is resulting in major temperature rises, erratic rainfall, drought is increasing in many areas. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where maize or corn is the staple crop. So two of the major international research organizations, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, or CIMMYT, and the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, have spearheaded the development of climate-smart maize in Africa. So over 10 years of work, these two organizations have partnered with dozens of local research organizations in the private sector to release around 160 varieties of maize. And what these varieties do is they have stabilized yield production. So even when you have drought stress, you don't lose the entire crop. You would I think on average it's like you get a half a ton more than you would if you provided if you planted a conventional variety. So, yeah, so over almost 9 million farmers have benefited from these innovations already. Another example at the other end of the spectrum is submergence tolerant rice. So every year, millions of small farmers in the poorest areas of the world lose their entire crops to flooding. So about a quarter of the global rice crop is grown in paddies, but most rice varieties will die if they're fully submerged for more than 3 days. So in India and Bangladesh alone, this is a big problem. Submergence destroys 4 million tons of rice each year, enough to feed 30 million people. So this is a long story. About 50 years ago, breeders discovered an unusual and very old variety of rice that could withstand 2 weeks of complete submergence. But it took until the mid-1990s until we had the tools so that researchers at UC Davis and USCA were able to isolate the genes related to submergence tolerance. They then worked with teams at the International Rice Research Institute to generate and release several sub-1, this is what it's called, submergence-tolerant rice, varieties in 7 countries. And then in 2015, with support from the Gates Foundation, sub-1 rice was grown already on 2.2 million hectares and reached almost 5 million farmers. So, alas, and a different kind of innovation here, but also really important, there have been important innovations in insurance and risk management. Traditional ag insurance assesses risk and claims on an individual basis, and it's not been widely adopted in low and middle income countries because it's expensive. There's often a lack of confidence in the system. And an alternative that's coming up is index-based insurance. So that's based on measuring an objective parameter that's highly correlated with actual losses that are sustained by farmers or herders. So for an example, an insurance payout scale may be agreed to in advance that's based on rainfall levels recorded at a given weather station. It's an important innovation that holds the potential to address widespread systemic catastrophic risk. Well, so how's this been applied? In the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, livestock herders, are very vulnerable now to climate change. Severe droughts have devastating effects on these pastoralists that can wipe out most of their livestock and lead to distress sales, which they can leave the herders then without a source of food or income and push them into poverty and vulnerability.
It also fuels conflict because those herders often tend to encroach on farmers' lands, and that can spark some confrontations, often violent ones.
Yes, exactly. Yes, we're seeing this happen a lot now in Nigeria, in Nigeria. Well, the International Livestock Research Institute and its partners have designed an index-based livestock insurance product that protects pastoralists from drought-related asset losses. So these solutions have been implemented now in the arid and semi-arid areas of Kenya and Ethiopia since 2010. And the government of Kenya has now adopted it at the national level, and its implementation is growing in Ethiopia, and it's recently been introduced in other Horn of Africa countries.
All of that is sounds really great. It does sound like there's some cause for hope, although I can't help but think that the UN report's conclusions, which is that we weren't on track to begin with to end world hunger by 2030, which is one of the sustainable development goals outlined by the UN. And now we're even further away from that target than we were prior to the pandemic. So how do you temper that sense that the progress we're making is just not nearly enough to be getting to where we need to be?
Well, I think that's right. The progress that we're making, there is progress, but it's not enough and it's not fast enough to to meet the needs that we're going to have over the next 50 years. And I think, when I think about this, I try to take a historic view. And, in the 1960s, there was, I would say, it's increasingly feeling a bit similar, a feeling of widespread pessimism about our ability to solve global hunger. There was a very influential book by Paul Ehrlich in 1968, The Population Bomb. I don't know if you know it, but that book essentially said the battle to feed all of humankind was over. Ehrlich predicted that in the 70s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in spite of crash aid programs. And the world couldn't possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980. And so, he was looking at this, the mid 60s, the Indian subcontinent was at war. They were experiencing widespread famine and starvation, and that the U.S., was essentially, keeping the subcontinent alive, making emergency shipments of millions of tons of wheat to the region year after year after year. And that famine became so serious that by 1965, the Indian and Pakistani governments relaxed their opposition to a scientist who'd been pleading to let him bring some of the new improved wheat strains he'd been developing into their countries for testing. So these were disease-resistant and dwarf varieties, very novel, short stature varieties. So why is that important? It's important because having a shorter stalk on the wheat means that the energy and resources of the plant were concentrated on the production of more grain rather than more stalk. And so this scientist's name was Norman Borlaug. And the initial yields of his varieties were higher than any that had ever been harvested in South Asia. In Pakistan, wheat yields nearly doubled. Pakistan became self-sufficient in wheat production by 1968. By 1974, India was self-sufficient in the production of all cereals. This was unimaginable in the 1960s. And Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and his work heralded a new era of scientific achievement in agriculture, which we know as the Green Revolution. This work was fueled initially by funding from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, beginning in the 1940s, and then by the early 1960s, there began to rise up this constellation of international research stations, which were then contributed to by other funders, beginning in the early 70s, the US, the World Bank, FAO, the UN. So, and this became this expanded network of international research centers that we know as the CGIAR today. So, I think, we look at today and we look at what happened in the 60s. We were facing famine. This book, The Population Bomb, was a bestseller. People thought that we were on the edge of doom. I think the lesson is that with science and innovation, collaboration, and public and private partnerships, it will be possible to meet this challenge of our generation. A food system that's more productive, but it's also more resilient, environmentally sustainable, and healthy. But this time, the innovations we need aren't just going to come from a Norman Borlaug or scientists. The scientists are important, but we're looking at a much wider range of innovators in the public and private sector. And something that encourages me is, in the alarm of this situation, the realization of the UN that we're not ever going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't transform our food systems. The UN Secretary General called for a UN Food Systems Summit. That's going to be held next month in New York. The preparations have been going on for almost a full year, and I think this has been very important to begin focusing people's attention, on the gravity of the problem and the scale of the resources and commitments that are needed. It's interesting that this is a different summit. This is not, the normal summit where you're focused on getting the government communique and et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of there. But this is called the People's Summit. And it's really put a priority on involving people, having consultations at the country level, involving indigenous peoples, involving youth very heavily, involving the private sector. So with the realization, and I think this is now what's different between the problems that confronted us in the 60s and now, realizing that the innovations that we need for the future, the science and innovations are going to come, from all of these different sources. So the pre-summit just concluded at the end of last month. And I think one of the most inspiring things to happen there was this, it was called a Good Food for All competition for small and medium-sized enterprises around the world. So they got some 2,000 entries, and they announced 50 winners. And half of the winners were youth, and almost half were women. And these winners came from 42 different countries. So just to give you sort of a sampling of, what are innovations that came up here? Many of the enterprises that won an award they're innovating and scaling solutions for nutrition and sustainability. So an Israeli company that produces chickpea protein powder, an Italian startup that's replacing plastic packaging with edible bio-based natural polymers, a Chinese enterprise that's offering monk fruit as an alternative to sugar. In Nigeria, one of the winners was an inclusive and efficient commodities market that's facilitating trade across the region. Other winners focused on ensuring resilience to shocks like COVID and climate change. In Canada, one business introduced silvopastoralism to enable sheep to graze on cover crops below their orchard trees to improve carbon sequestration. There was a Colombian company that helps women growers market their own coffee brands, and the first Bulgarian zero-waste restaurant that employs underprivileged youth. So food for that restaurant is 95% locally grown. And I think really important is that, educating communities about the importance of transforming food systems was at the heart of many of these enterprises. A Bolivian restaurant training young chefs to value Bolivia's food heritage and promote healthier diets. In Nepal, urban consumers connected to more than 10,000 farmers through an e-commerce digital platform. So I think, these preparations, these enterprises are giving us a foretaste of, some of the opportunity, incitement, and, the real energy that's out there from tomorrow's innovators.
Well, that's great. That's a really good, hopeful note to end on. Julie, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Great to talk with you.
Julie Howard is a senior advisor to the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.